What's up, my IBMOR brothers? Just here because I found something interesting. Not Rael, but Black Mind threw up this chart about voluntarily and involuntarily celibate. And he was saying, unless this chart is doctored, then there's something going on, right? I never really said what was going on, but people throw up charts. There's no explanation. Some charts that you're basically using it to promote a thesis, and the chart that you're using, you pretty much explain the numbers are fairly self-explanatory. And so the chart and its link or its subject can be searched upon. So even though I love to collect charts myself, and I like to throw them on the screen for emphasis, but I hate for people to throw up one chart and have it stand by itself. When I throw up a chart, when I throw up a figure, I don't show you just one. I show you like at least 5 or 6 in the same vein, so it doesn't stand by itself. Because one chart by itself, unless you bring information with it, actually confuse more people than it will actually enlighten. So he threw up this particular chart, and I asked where the link was. And so instead of waiting on his response, I just went and found it myself. It took maybe 30 seconds. So I found a chart, and I found the study where it's from. And the chart is real, and it did come from a study, the Institute for Family Studies, May 14, 2018. And it comes from a blog called Male Sexlessness is Rising, but Not for the Reasons Incels Claim. The share of the male population aged 22 to 35 who have never been married and haven't had sex in at least a year is almost certainly higher than a decade ago. This is the primary cause of the rise in sexlessness is simply the increasing delay of marriage. I'm just going to tell you up front, the rise of virginity is going to come at the end, right? So hold your horses. We'll get to it. A recent terrorist attack in Toronto, which left 10 people dead, has brought about global attention to the Incel movement, which stands for involuntarily celibate. The term refers to a growing number of people, particularly young men, who feel shut out of any possibility for romance and have formed a community based around mourning their celibacy, supporting each other, and in some cases stoking a culture of impotent bitterness and rage at the wider world. In a few cases, this rage has spilled over in the form of terrorist attacks by incels. While the incels' misogyny deserves to be called out and condemned, their ideas are unlikely to just go away. As such, the question must be posed: is the incel account of modern sexual life correct or not? Incel communities tend to believe a few key facts about modern mating practices. First, they tend to believe that women have become very sexually promiscuous over time, and indeed that virtually all women are highly promiscuous. The nickname incels use for attractive, sexually available woman is Stacy. Second, they believe a small number of males dominate the market for romance, and that their dominance is growing. They call these alpha males Chads. Finally, they tend to argue that the market for sex is winner take all, with a few Chads conquering all the Stacys. The allegedly handsome and masculine Chads are helped along by social media, Tinder, and allegedly vacuous and appearance-focused dating scene, such that modern society gives Chads excessive amounts of sex while leaving a growing number of males with no sexual partner at all. These left-out men are the incels. This view is basically wrong, which is something I've said quite a bit. Ain't that many. But it turns out to be wrong in an interesting and informative way. How much sex are people having? First of all, we may wonder about the actual trends in sexual behavior. Using data from the General Social Survey, GSS, it's possible to estimate about how often people of different groups have sex. For this article, I will focus on individuals aged 22 to 35 who have never been married, and particularly males within that group. Most groups of people 22 to 35 have broadly similar amounts of sex, probably something like 60 to 100 sexual encounters per year. Never married people have the least sex, about 60 to 80 encounters per year, while ever married people have more sex, about 70 to 110 encounters per year on average. Historically, never married men have reported higher sexual frequency than never married women. However, in the 2014 and 2016 GSS samples, that changed. Never married men now report slightly lower sexual frequency than never married women. This is mostly because men are reporting less sex, not that women are reporting more sex. Female sexual frequency is essentially unchanged since 2000. In other words, a key piece of the incel story about rising female promiscuity just isn't there. But sexual frequency may be dominated by Chads and Stacys. What we really want to know is what share of these men and women have not had any sex. The graph below shows what share of these men and women have not had any sex at all in the last 12 months by their sexual and marital status. And this is a chart. Share with no sex in the past year. Blue equals men, red equals women, solid lines equal married, dotted lines equals never married. And it shows in the last year, never married men that haven't had sex in the past year is 20%. Now, we don't know what the age, well, we do know what the age is, 22 to 35, which is the mating age range for most people. It's 20% for men, and it's actually 16% for women. And if you look at between 1990 and I would say 2010, it was virtually even, with men being slightly higher in some cases, women being slightly higher in other cases, until we get to like 2010. I think this is the rise of the dating apps, which you can actually see the effect in never married men and women. But now there's, instead of it being in sync with each other, it's like a 4% gap. And as we can see in married men and married women, it's a 2% gap, but it's pretty much in line with each other. You got to remember, this is reporting. The share of people of each status who report not having sex in the past year shows interesting trends that seem to support the basic incel account of changes in mating markets. Recent years have seen increasing sexlessness for never married men. Celibacy is approximately stable among women. Notably, male sexlessness is also rising amongst married men. That's true. On the one hand, the incel story of rising male celibacy seems confirmed here. More and more never married men are experiencing long sexual droughts. But on the other hand, incels are basically wrong in suggesting that virtually all women are promiscuous. Female sexlessness has been roughly stable over time, and indeed has actually risen since the period from 2005 and 2010, it was an incel that I heard. He said exactly that. It's not just the men, it's also the men and women not getting together. However, two other large surveys, the National Survey of Family Growth and the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, also ask about sexual behavior. Their results do not confirm the trend seen in the GSS. However, they have slightly different questions and slightly different survey populations, so they may not be directly comparable. The NSG, for example, shows far higher rates of sexlessness to begin with. It actually shows the NSG 24% to begin with and dropping down to 20%, and then the GSS they've actually showed in 2010, which is a huge jump. I do believe you can see this jump. This is the rise of the dating apps. I have a theory about that, but I'm not going to talk about it right here. The graph above shows that while there's some reason to think that a growing share of never married men is going sexless based on GSS data, it could be that the sexless share among these men is about stable. The NHANES shows or even falling as the NFFG shows. One survey shows it's rising, the other two shows that it's falling. The Incel account of events thus far is a maybe true in the GSS, but face strong rebuttals from the NHANES and the NFFG data. Not a glowing endorsement of the Incel narrative, though a few sexual alphas dominate the sexual economy. But even assuming that the GSS data is correct, we can't ask if another piece of the Incel narrative is true. Do a few Chads and Stacys really monopolize the market for sex? Many Incels quote a rule of thumb that 20% of the men, there's the old 80-20 rule, have 80% of the sex. Is this true? As it turns out, the answer is no. And of course it isn't. Imagine how much sex those 20% of men would have to be having. A substantial share would need to be doing 2-a-days on a regular basis to maintain that kind of share. In reality, according to GSS, the top 20% of the most sexually active never married men have about 50 to 60% of the sex. It's about the same for women. These shares are basically stable over time. Measuring the number of partners instead of frequency, the top 20% most promiscuous men account for about 60% of male sexual partnerings, and the trend is, again, quite stable over time. So instead of the 80-20 rule, it's the 20-60 rule. Thus, whatever the change in total sexlessness, there's no appreciable change in the concentration of sex among never married young men and women. The core Incel story about what's going on here, that a few Chads are hoarding a growing share of Stacys, depriving Incels of mates, just doesn't hold up. The top 20% of unmarried men are having about the same share of total sexual activity or sexual partnerings as has been the case for decades. And of those very promiscuous men, a small share actually report having paid for or being paid for sex. That is, a few of these men whom Incels might think are Chads based on data actually have high sexual frequencies, not due to being so desirable, but due to hiring prostitutes or themselves being male sex workers. Ding, 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 winner, 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 chicken dinner. I've said that too. So if it's not rakish Chads hoarding all the women, what's going on? The decline of youthful marriage. We can take the data from 3 sources on sexual behavior, GSS, NHANES, and NSFG, and apply it to available data from the American Community Survey and the decennial census about marriage and see what share of the total male population is probably sexless. The graph below estimates the share of male population aged 22 to 35 who have never been married and who have not had sex in the last year. The trend in the total male population aged 22 to 35 made up of these sexless men is changing. All sources, including NSFG and NHANES, show the latest values to be higher than values estimated between 2000 and 2005. In other words, the share of male population aged 22 to 35 who have never been married and haven't had sex in at least a year is almost certainly higher than it was a decade or two ago. The exact trend, as well as whether this figure is rising or not, is much more debatable, but the very broad outcome of higher sexlessness today than a decade ago is indisputable. The main factor driving this trend, however, isn't Chads and Stacys, but just declining marriage rates amongst young men. The share of men aged 22 to 35 who have never been married is higher today than at any time since the first data we have, going back to 1880. The marriage share for these men is far lower than the historic norm. Unmarried people have less sex in general. So even if celibacy rates within marital status are the same, the sexless population grows. Why are sexless men sexless, aside from delayed marriage? But how much of this is really about involuntary celibacy? Interestingly enough, the NSFG, which is about 1,000 never married men ages 22 to 35 in each sample period, also asked men who have never had sex, about half to 2/3 of the men who haven't had sex in the last year, why they are still virgins. The lion's share of the decline in virginity in the NSFG is due to falling religiosity. The share of never married men ages 22 to 35 who were virgins due to religious abstention fell from 4.7% in 2006-2010 to 3% in 2013 to 2015. The share who are virgins due to fear of STDs has fallen from 0.8% to 0.4%, while the share abstaining due to fear of conception has risen from 0.1% to 0.5%. The share who are in a relationship but just haven't had the right moment has fallen from 0.8% to 0.4%, while the share who are virgins due to not having found a suitable partner yet has risen from 3.6% to 4%, and while the share who cite other reasons has risen from 1.6% to 2.5%. Thus, while the NSFG shows sexlessness declining, essentially involuntary sources of sexlessness, which I consider to be other and lack of a suitable partner, are stable or rising. Virtually the whole decline in NSFG measured sexlessness is a decline in involuntary sexlessness. Virtually the whole decline in NFSG measured sexlessness is a decline in voluntary sexlessness. That is, sexlessness due to religious timing or health concerns. Using NSFG figure for sexual abstention and ACS marital demographics, we can estimate a hardcore incel population, that is, a share of never married men ages 22 to 35 who have never had sex and whose reason for never having sex isn't abstention for religious timing or health reasons. This hardcore incel group is indeed growing as a share of male population. The NSFG sample size, over 1,000 never married men between the ages of 22 and 35, with sufficient questionnaire completion to estimate sexual behavior and reasons for virginity if they have not had sex, is large enough to be decently confident of these results. But the 68% increase from 2002 to 2015 in the incel share of the male never married 22 to 35-year-old population is mostly due to the decline in marriage, not never married men having less sex. Rising involuntary virginity amongst never marrieds account for about 27 percentage points of the increase, with the other 41 percentage points coming from a declining married share of the population. It may also be that some of these incels are males who were formerly or would formerly have been religious, and while they no longer abstain for religious reasons, nonetheless they may continue to hold some degree of religious norms regarding high standards for a first sexual encounter. It's not involuntary. In fact, the incel that I heard on Sandman's video said it was not involuntary. It's actually voluntary. In other words, incels are right to see themselves as part of a novel and fairly extreme change in our society's sexual behavior, with a growing share of sexless men. But the big change isn't a growing share of alpha males hoarding all the sex, nor women suddenly becoming far more choosy amid rising promiscuity. Rather, it's just that marriage is being delayed, which means that rates of marriage status control celibacy that aren't extremely unusual result in very unusual rates of the total population-wide sexlessness. We can also see what factors tend to predict virginity among never married men in recent years. For example, virginity is somewhat more common amongst more educated young men. This is true for both the men I classify as involuntarily celibate and especially those who are voluntarily celibate. And it shows you how delayed marriage and delay in education go hand in hand with virginity, voluntary and involuntary. Even at that, only 8% of never married men, or the average of like 6% of never married men, are virgins. It's not that high. And you can see the reason you have Chads is the ones that have never graduated from college, the vast majority. The NFSG also shows that virginity, both voluntary and involuntary, is higher among men living with their parents. More millennials live with their parents. About 8% of never married young men living with their parents are involuntarily sexless. Another 7% are voluntarily so. Among men not living with their parents, it's just 4% involuntarily sexless and 2% voluntarily so. Looking at sex in the last year, instead of virginity, never married young men without their parents are about 17% sexless versus nearly 30% among those who live with their parents. Even when these variables are combined together, more education is associated with more sexlessness among both men who live with their parents and men who do not. Living with parents is associated with more sexlessness across all educational levels. That makes sense. Some of that is due to voluntary celibacy. Men who live with their parents are more likely to be religious or concerned about STDs or the risk of conception. When we restrict to just involuntary celibacy, the sample size becomes too small to say anything conclusively about whether more education or parental co-residence is a dominant driver of virginity. It seems like living with parents increases virginity, especially for less educated men, but the effect size is not statistically significant. Overall, male virginity in the NSFG is associated with higher education and residence with parents. On the other hand, data from GSS suggests that not having sex in the last year may be associated with less education, although this isn't a measure of virginity. But whatever the direct effect of education on never married men, the primary cause of the rise in sexlessness is simply increasing delay of marriage. The delay of marriage has numerous causes, of course, but probably the most powerful driver of marital timing relates to education. Men and women are less likely to get married while attending school, and across times and countries, an increase in the years of schooling is associated with the latter age of marriage. Though more educated people do tend to get married eventually, thus, as more schooling becomes necessary for good middle-class job, and marriage gets pushed later and later, leaving more young people, men and women, companionless and lonely. The rise of young male sexlessness is not about Chads and Stacy's. It isn't about Tinder or Bumble. It's not mostly about attitudinal shifts in what women want from relationships, and it's not mainly about some new war between the sexes. It's mostly about people spending more time in school and spending more years living at home. But that's not actually a story about some change in sexual politics. Instead, it's a story about the modern knowledge economy and, to some extent, exorbitant housing costs. I agree. As such, no surprise that rising sexlessness is being observed in many countries. This in turn suggests that finding a solution to help young people pair up may not be as easy. That was rather long, but very, very informative. When you go back to the source and they actually measure this, the simplistic fact that a lot of men give for being an incel has multiple factors, but I think the biggest factor, one of the biggest factor, is they're going by their freaking phone. The 80-20 rule, whenever I ask how do they prove the 80-20 rule, they always go back to Tinder, to Bumble, to whatever dating app they happen to be on. And the so-called Chads that are having a lot of sex are sometimes paying for it. And then one other thing is that in the past, people were less likely to be engaged into their screens, their computers, their phones, or being online. They were actually out meeting each other. So they approach women. And since they approached more women, they got more sex. I think the incels, or what we could think involuntarily celibates, will actually go down if they approached. Even at that, what they're saying is it's about less than 10%. It's not 80% like they claim. It's not even close. And for the reasons that they claim, if they really wanted to be having sex like the high frequency guys or the Chads, they would do what Chad does: make a lot of money and buy call girls, or buy sugar babies, or buy sugar mamas. There's lots of different things that Chads and incels can do to break that up. Simply say for young incels, actually date older women. A lot of older women that are sexless because they can't find a mate. Once them, it's basically accessible. It's basically free for the most part. You can consume that available spot, that available vagina, if you really wanted to. A lot of what we call incel, involuntarily celibate, even involuntarily virginity, is based on really not being involuntary. It's really not environmental. It's really voluntary. Most sexlessness or celibacy is voluntary, even to the point where you can go down to the local brothel and knock off a piece. If you could do that, especially in America, any back page, you can do that, you can get rid of your virginity. You're not getting rid of your virginity because it's involuntary. You're not getting rid of your virginity is because it's actually voluntary. You're choosing not to do it. You're choosing not to take certain access. And basically, what I heard the incel community wanting is love. They want the right partner, whatever that means. And so since they want they want to fall in love first for their first time. Now, they're not getting those encounters because as you get older, that kind of falling in love at happenstance is not going to happen behind a computer screen or a phone. They got to get out there and feel. So I think a lot of this stuff is simply not trying. But anyway, Black Mind actually, posted that particular chart in his community tab, and I was actually fascinated. So kudos to Black Mind, because I had doubted whether it was real or not, but turns out it is real. It was a survey. It was actually a certified poll given by a certified agency, but there's a larger story behind that particular chart. So I'm sure Black Mind will do a video on it. Mine is probably the first. I'm wondering why this survey that's like 2 years old, the incels haven't touched. Probably because it goes against their narrative. So what do I say about the incel community, or even the voluntary celibate community? I go, come on, y'all. Be real. I hate this bullshit about this 80-20 rule and blaming women for you not having sex. Be real. Come on, y'all, grow up and be men. If you want sex and you really want it that bad, and you stop being moralistic, stop being whatever, if you got a trick to get it, got a trick to get off the slide, man. You got to fly to Mexico or Brazil or Canada, wherever you need to get it. Europe, Africa, Thailand. Go get that monkey off your back. If you had cancer, you fly to wherever you need to go to get it done with. Instead of complaining about it, and instead of complaining about the Chads and the Stacys and women not giving up sex, go to where the sex is. Do it in Patrice O'Neal. Get that monkey off your back, come back, and then start approaching. Because it's not, sex has been around for 2 million years. It's not a mystery. Okay, you have plenty of coaches, plenty of books, plenty of information on how to actually approach women and get what you need. And a lot of what I hear from guys is, you guys want 7, 8s, and 9s. Okay, and you guys qualify for 4, 5, and 6s. And trust and believe your Chads, who you think are so square-jawed and sexy, are screwing 4, 5, and 6s, because that's where the vast majority of women are. You ain't gonna be screwing a whole lot of 7, 8s, and 9s unless you got a whole bunch of money. And like I said, the vast majority of Chads are very wealthy people. We're very wealthy guys. You can actually pay for escort services and pay for their partners because they don't have time. And people that are actually sex workers, like strippers, male strippers. Now, the few guys that are 100 octane, that are what I call ballers, even ballers are actually paying for their sex. Most ball players that get sex from all these women are actually funding them a lifestyle. That shit's not free. All them fine ass baby mamas and whatnot, that shit's not free. They're actually paying. Because if there wasn't a financial incentive to go with those guys, they wouldn't be getting that much sex. Now, are these alpha dogs having more sex than you would? Yeah, because of their physicality, yes, they would. But it wouldn't be that extraordinarily high. It's extraordinarily high because they're paying for it. And these women are actually spread around these various groups of men. If these chicks are chasing ballers, they're screwing all the ballers at all different stages, from college to the pros. And then when they age out at 30, they get tossed back into the pile. And that's where you get them, in the secondary market. Trust and believe, even if you're not marrying, a lot of you guys are having sex with these chicks on the secondary market. Even if they're baby mamas. You might not be marrying them, but you're having sex with them. You get sick of all this moralizing. This is either for guys that are not having sex. You guys are the biggest moralizing group I've ever heard in my life. In the real world, they don't do all this moralizing. If you're tricking, you're tricking. There's not that big a difference between tricking on a chick, paying for dates, tricking on a chick, which they call dinner hoes, versus regular hoes. The only difference between dinner hoes and regular hoes is that it's direct. You actually get what you pay for. Whereas with dinner hoes, it's the promise of sex. And with the COVID economy coming, it's going to be these partners, quote unquote, is going to be cheaper and more plentiful. So if you don't get laid in 2021, or even at the outside 2022, it's because you don't want to. Because your moral standards are so high that it's ridiculous. You sound like a lot of the women that call in to Kevin's show talk about a high value man, okay? I'm not saying you have to go crazy, that you got to get yourself a 3 or a 2. What I'm saying is use a reasonable expectation. The vast majority of women are 4, 5s, and 6s. If you stay in that range, that's 70% of the women. 70%. The 7, 8s, and 9s are outside of that percentage. Just like the 1, 2s, and 3s are outside of the percentage. 70% of the women are 4, 5, and 6. If you can't find a 5 and 6, go ahead and get you a 4 and be good. Okay? I used to. Can't find a 5 and a 6. She's too busy or too uppity. I get me a 4. I break glass in case of an emergency. Go get you a 4. Go get your rocks off. Go sit down and have a chat. Have a nice, comfortable chat. Have a comfortable, sometimes a relationship. You can have a relationship with a 4. If you get past your ego, they're human beings just like everybody else. They talk just like everybody else. And there really isn't that huge a difference in attitude and relationship between a 4 and a 6. It really isn't. But that's enough for me preaching this morning. I hope you guys have fun with me putting this together. Shout out to Black Mind. I'll throw the link to his channel in the description so you guys can go check out his channel. He has, Black Mind has some good thoughts and information. So sometimes I 100% agree, and sometimes I go, Black Mind, yeah, can't ride with that. But that's with anybody. I'm sure he says that about me. But with that, I'm going to jump off of here. This is